Paul Simon was the quiet craftsman of American songwriting. A small man with a soft voice, a guitar held close to his chest, and melodies that moved through generations. His name became attached to some of the most recognizable songs of the 20th century. Songs played at weddings. Songs played at funerals. Songs that seemed gentle on the surface. But the public image hid something else. Behind the careful harmonies and poetic lyrics was a life built on pressure, fractured partnerships, relentless expectations, and the slow erosion that comes with decades inside the machinery of fame. Before the awards and sold-out arenas, there was a cramped apartment in New York. There was a father struggling to keep steady work as a musician. There was a young boy watching his parents argue about money and stability. And there was rejection, record deals that failed, songs that disappeared without notice, years where the dream of music looked less like destiny and more like a mistake. Success came, but it came with a cost. Partnerships broke. Friendships collapsed in public. The music industry changed around him, chewing through artists faster each decade. Fame demanded constant reinvention, constant touring, constant exposure. And time, slowly but relentlessly, took its share. Now, at 84, the reality of Paul Simon's life looks very different from the image people carry in their heads. The voice is quieter. The body moves slower. Hearing fades. Memory becomes selective. And the questions begin to surface. What does a lifetime of music actually leave behind when the applause stops? And what happens when the artist who wrote the soundtrack of millions of lives is forced to confront the silence waiting at the end? Before we begin, take a moment to leave a like on this video as a tribute to Paul Simon and the long, complicated road that brought him here. Because the story does not start with fame. It starts with a boy in Queens, New York, trying to understand the world through sound. Paul Frederick Simon was born on October 13, 1941, in Newark, New Jersey, though his childhood unfolded largely in the neighborhood of Kew Gardens Hills in Queens. The area in the 1940s was a dense grid of apartment buildings filled with immigrant families, many of them Jewish, many working long hours just to maintain a modest life. His father, Louis Simon, was a college professor and a bass player who worked in dance bands. The combination meant a life divided between academic work and late-night performances. His mother, Belle Simon, was an elementary school teacher. The household valued education, but it also carried the unpredictability that comes with creative professions. Music existed in the apartment constantly, not as a glamorous pursuit but as background labor. Rehearsals, instruments leaning against walls, conversations about gigs that paid little but had to be taken anyway. For young Paul, music was less a dream than an atmosphere. But the home was not peaceful in the way nostalgia might suggest. Money was tight at times. Academic work did not always translate into financial stability, and the music business in the 1940s and 1950s was unstable by design. Statistics from that era show that fewer than 5% of working musicians in the United States earned a consistent living from performing. Most moved between teaching, small gigs, and temporary work just to maintain income. Paul Simon watched that reality closely. He also watched his father struggle with recognition. Louis Simon was respected locally, but the larger success he may have wanted never arrived. That kind of quiet disappointment tends to settle into a household. Children notice it even when nobody explains it. Paul was not a physically imposing child. He was small, thin, and reserved. In school he did not dominate rooms. He observed them. His earliest interests were baseball and radio. Baseball offered the clear structure of statistics and rules. Radio offered something else. Voices moving through invisible space, songs arriving from cities he had never seen. By the early 1950s, American culture was undergoing a transformation driven by broadcast media. Radio ownership had exploded across the country. Nearly 90% of American households owned at least one radio set. For a child in Queens, that meant constant access to music. Rhythm and blues, country, early rock and roll. Genres that crossed geographic boundaries began pouring into urban neighborhoods. Paul Simon listened carefully. He studied patterns, melodies, chord changes. But one event during his childhood would alter his life permanently. In 1953, when Paul was around 12 years old, he met a boy named Art Garfunkel at school. The meeting was not dramatic. It happened through a school play. But the two boys discovered something immediately. Their voices worked together. Not just in the technical sense of harmony. There was something more precise about it. Simon's lower, tighter vocal tone balanced against Garfunkel's higher, clearer range. They began singing together casually. At that age, it was imitation more than innovation. They copied songs they heard on the radio. The Everly Brothers. Early rock and roll hits. Street corner harmony styles that defined teenage culture in the 1950s. But there was already a pattern forming. Simon was the builder, the one interested in writing and structure. Garfunkel was the vocalist, the one capable of projecting emotion with clarity. By the time they reached their mid-teens, they were already experimenting with recording. In 1957, at just 16 years old, Simon and Garfunkel recorded a song called Hey Schoolgirl under the name Tom and Jerry. The song became a minor hit. It reached the lower half of the Billboard charts. For most teenagers, that moment would have felt like a rival. For Simon, it created something more complicated. Because the music industry is rarely patient with young artists. Labels push for quick repetition of success. If a hit emerges, they want another immediately. If it doesn't happen, the artist is quietly abandoned. Tom and Jerry released follow-up singles. None of them performed well. Within a short period, the momentum vanished. Simon was still a teenager when he encountered the first major reality of the industry. Early success means nothing if it cannot be repeated. He enrolled at Queen's College while continuing to pursue music. College life introduced him to literature, poetry, and classical composition techniques. This is where his songwriting began to change. Instead of simple teenage rock songs, Simon began experimenting with narrative lyrics and unusual melodic structures. He listened closely to the emerging folk movement in Greenwich Village. The early 1960s folk revival produced artists who treated songwriting as literary craft rather than simple entertainment. Coffee houses replaced dance halls. Acoustic guitars replaced amplified bands. But the folk scene was competitive. By 1962, Greenwich Village contained hundreds of aspiring performers. Small clubs held open mic nights where dozens of musicians competed for a few minutes of stage time. Simon entered that environment with ambition but limited recognition. The reality was brutal. He performed in small rooms where audiences barely listened. Sometimes there were only a handful of people present. Payment was inconsistent. Some nights musicians received a few dollars. Other nights they received nothing. Research from that period shows that many folk musicians in Greenwich Village survived on less than $20 per week from performing. Simon persisted. He wrote constantly. Songs about loneliness, alienation, quiet observation of urban life. These themes would later define his style. But at the time, record labels did not immediately recognize the potential. Simon and Garfunkel reunited briefly to record an album in 1964 called Wednesday Morning, 3 a.m. The album failed. Sales were minimal. Critics barely noticed it. Within months, Simon left for England, believing his career in the United States had effectively stalled. England offered a different environment. The folk scene there valued acoustic storytelling and lyrical experimentation. Simon performed in small British clubs, sometimes sleeping on couches or cheap rented rooms between gigs. Those months were formative. He refined his songwriting discipline. He observed audiences carefully. He began writing songs that balanced personal introspection with broader cultural commentary. One of those songs would eventually become one of the most recognizable pieces of music in modern history. But when he first wrote it, there was no sign that it would change anything. The song was quiet, minimal, built around acoustic guitar and sparse vocals. It was called The Sound of Silence. At the time Simon composed it, the song reflected isolation rather than triumph. The lyrics described disconnection, people speaking without understanding each other, voices lost in empty spaces. It mirrored the emotional reality Simon had been experiencing, a young songwriter unsure whether the world would ever hear his work. Meanwhile, back in the United States, something unexpected was happening. A producer named Tom Wilson decided to remix The Sound of Silence without Simon's involvement. Electric instruments were added. The arrangement shifted toward folk rock, a style that was suddenly gaining popularity. The new version began receiving radio play in 1965. By the time Simon returned to America, the song had become a national hit. The transformation was sudden. One moment Simon was an obscure folk musician performing in small rooms. The next moment he was part of a chart-topping act. But success created a new pressure. Because when a single song explodes across the country, the question becomes immediate and unavoidable. What comes next? For Paul Simon, the answer would reshape not only his career, but also his friendships, his identity, and eventually the entire landscape of American music. But the foundation of that transformation, the insecurity, the discipline, the years of obscurity, had already been laid during those early years in Queens and Greenwich Village. The boy who once listened quietly to the radio had entered a world where millions of people were now listening to him. When Paul Simon returned to the United States in 1965, he stepped into a situation that had already moved ahead of him. The Sound of Silence had climbed the charts without his direct involvement. The electric remix released by producer Tom Wilson had reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Radio stations across the country were playing the song repeatedly. Suddenly, the record label that had quietly ignored Simon and Garfunkel months earlier wanted more music immediately. This is a common pattern inside the music industry. A single unexpected hit changes the financial equation overnight. Labels move quickly to capture momentum before public attention shifts elsewhere. Simon and Garfunkel reunited under pressure. They returned to the studio to produce a new album, Sounds of Silence, released in early 1966. The success was immediate. The album produced multiple charting songs, and the duo began touring extensively. But the partnership between Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel was never simple. The dynamic between them had existed since childhood. Simon was the primary songwriter. He constructed the melodies, the lyrics, the arrangements. Garfunkel was the voice that delivered them with clarity. In theory, it was a balanced collaboration. In reality, it created tension. The structure of the music industry at the time rewarded the writer more than the performer. Songwriting royalties generated long-term income. Performance alone did not carry the same financial weight. Simon knew this. Garfunkel knew this. The imbalance sat quietly between them as their fame grew. By 1966, the duo was no longer playing small clubs. They were performing in large concert halls and appearing on national television programs. Their music connected with a generation navigating political upheaval and cultural change. The Vietnam War was escalating. Civil rights protests filled American streets. Universities across the country were becoming centers of political debate. Simon's songwriting began reflecting that environment. In 1966, the duo released Parsley, Sage, Rosemary and Thyme. The album contained songs that addressed alienation, technological anxiety, and social fragmentation. Simon was developing a reputation for writing lyrics that sounded reflective rather than confrontational. He did not shout political messages. Instead, he described quiet observations about the world changing around him. From a commercial standpoint, the approach worked. Album sales increased. Concert audiences grew larger. The duo became one of the defining musical acts of the late 1960s. But inside the partnership, strain continued to build. Garfunkel had ambitions beyond music. He began pursuing acting opportunities. Film roles required time away from recording sessions. Simon, meanwhile, remained focused on writing and studio work. This difference in priorities slowly widened the distance between them. One of the most visible moments came during the production of the 1968 album Bookends. Simon had written a series of songs connected by themes of aging, memory, and the passage of time. He approached the project with meticulous attention to arrangement and structure. Studio sessions became long and demanding. Simon insisted on repeated takes. He refined small details obsessively. For Garfunkel, the process could feel exhausting. For Simon, it was necessary. That difference in working style became a recurring conflict. Despite the tension, Bookends succeeded commercially. The album reached #1 on the Billboard charts and produced another defining song, Mrs. Robinson. The song had originally been written for the film The Graduate, directed by Mike Nichols. Garfunkel had taken an acting role in the film, playing one of the characters. The movie became a cultural phenomenon. Mrs. Robinson won the Grammy Award for Record of the Year in 1969. Simon and Garfunkel were now not only popular musicians but also symbols of a generation navigating uncertainty. But public success does not remove private friction. By the late 1960s, Communication between Simon and Garfunkel had deteriorated significantly. Interviews from the period reveal subtle but visible tension. Simon often spoke about songwriting as a solitary process. Garfunkel spoke about artistic freedom and the desire to pursue multiple creative directions. Behind the scenes, arguments were frequent. The music industry during this period placed enormous pressure on successful acts to produce new material continuously. Tours stretched across months. Recording schedules compressed creative work into strict deadlines. Studies of touring musicians from the late 1960s show that many performers spent more than 200 days per year traveling. Fatigue accumulated. Relationships strained. Simon responded to pressure by working harder. He wrote more songs, refined arrangements, and pushed for higher production standards. But that discipline came with emotional cost. He became known among collaborators as intensely focused, sometimes to the point of isolation. The next album, Bridge Over Troubled Water, would become the peak of Simon and Garfunkel's career. Released in 1970, the album sold millions of copies worldwide and produced several iconic songs. The title track, Bridge Over Troubled Water, featured Garfunkel's voice prominently. The arrangement used orchestral elements and gospel influences. The song became one of the most recognizable recordings in American music. It won multiple Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. But the success came at the moment when the partnership was already breaking apart. Recording sessions had become increasingly tense. Simon and Garfunkel were rarely in the studio together for extended periods. Communication often occurred through producers and engineers rather than direct conversation. When Bridge Over Troubled Water was completed, the duo separated. It was not a dramatic public breakup. There was no single explosive argument that ended everything. Instead, the partnership dissolved through accumulation. Years of creative disagreement, different ambitions, exhaustion from constant work. By 1970, Paul Simon began his career as a solo artist. For many musicians, leaving a successful partnership would represent a major risk. Statistics from the music industry show that solo careers launched after the breakup of major duos or bands often struggle to maintain the same level of commercial success. Simon approached the transition carefully. His self-titled solo album, released in 1972, introduced a new direction. The record incorporated Latin rhythms and world music influences that had not been central to the Simon and Garfunkel catalog. Critics responded positively. The album produced the hit single Mother and Child Reunion, which reached the top 10 in the United States. But the next project would define Simon's solo identity more clearly. In 1973, he released There Goes Rhymin' Simon. The album blended gospel, rhythm and blues, and traditional American songwriting structures. It contained songs like Kodachrome and Loves Me Like a Rock. Both songs became major hits. For Simon, the success proved something important. He could survive outside the shadow of the duo. Yet the emotional complexity of the earlier partnership did not disappear. Simon and Garfunkel occasionally reunited for concerts and television appearances. These reunions attracted enormous attention because audiences still associated their voices with a specific cultural moment. But the personal relationship remained fragile. Outside of music, Simon's personal life became increasingly complicated. His first marriage, to Peggy Harper in 1969, ended in divorce in 1975. The relationship had developed during the height of Simon and Garfunkel's success, when touring and recording schedules dominated his life. The marriage struggled under the weight of those demands. Later relationships would attract intense public attention, particularly his relationship with actress Carrie Fisher. Their connection began in the late 1970s. Fisher was widely known for her role as Princess Leia in the Star Wars films. The pairing created a collision between two different forms of celebrity. Their relationship moved quickly. They married in 1983, but the marriage lasted less than a year. The divorce was finalized in 1984. Fisher later spoke openly about the volatility of their relationship. Both partners carried strong personalities and demanding careers. For Simon, these personal disruptions occurred alongside constant artistic pressure. He continued releasing albums throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Some achieved moderate success. Others received mixed responses from critics. The music industry itself was also changing. By the early 1980s, MTV had transformed the way artists reached audiences. Visual presentation became central to commercial success. Younger performers dominated the charts. Simon was entering his mid-40s during this period, an age when many musicians begin to lose mainstream visibility. Then, in 1986, he released an album that would redefine the second half of his career. The album was called Graceland. The project emerged from Simon's interest in South African music. He collaborated with local musicians, incorporating rhythmic structures and vocal styles rarely heard in American pop recordings at the time. But the project was not without controversy. South Africa in the 1980s was still under apartheid, a system of institutional racial segregation. Many artists had agreed to boycott cultural collaboration with the country as a form of protest. Simon's decision to record there triggered criticism from some activists. He argued that the project supported South African musicians rather than the government. The debate continued for years. Commercially, Graceland became a massive success. The album sold millions of copies worldwide and won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year in 1987. Songs like You Can Call Me Al became defining recordings of the decade. But the triumph did not erase the complexity surrounding the project. Simon found himself navigating criticism from political organizations while simultaneously receiving praise from critics and audiences. The experience reinforced something that had followed him throughout his career. Success rarely arrived without some form of backlash. As the 1990s approached, Simon had already lived through several cycles of reinvention. Childhood musician, teenage recording artist, half of a legendary duo, solo songwriter, controversial cultural collaborator. Each phase had brought new recognition but also new complications. And as the decades continued, the physical reality of aging would begin to intersect with the long history he had built. The voice that once carried effortlessly across concert halls would gradually change. The stamina required for touring would decline. And the man who had spent his life filling silence with music would eventually confront the quiet spaces that come with age. By the time Paul Simon entered his 70s, the pace of his life had already begun to change. For decades his routine had been mechanical and repetitive. Writing, recording, rehearsing, touring, repeating the cycle across continents. A working musician's life does not slow naturally. It stops only when the body begins to resist the schedule. Simon had spent more than 50 years inside that cycle. By the early 2000s, the music industry itself had shifted again. Physical album sales had collapsed. Digital distribution changed the economics of recording. Younger artists dominated streaming platforms. For legacy musicians like Paul Simon, the focus moved toward live performance. Touring had become the primary source of income for many artists who began their careers before the digital era. Industry research shows that by the mid-2010s, touring generated more than 70% of revenue for many established musicians. Simon continued performing regularly. He was no longer the young songwriter standing alone with an acoustic guitar in Greenwich Village. Concert productions had become large, complex events with full bands and carefully designed lighting systems. But behind the stage, the reality of aging was gradually asserting itself. Simon had always been physically small. Even during his younger years, he stood just over 5 feet tall and carried a light frame. That kind of body often ages differently than the public expects. Endurance declines. Muscles weaken more quickly. Touring at an advanced age becomes an engineering problem. Air travel disrupts sleep. Rehearsals strain joints and vocal cords. Long performances require stamina that the body slowly begins to withdraw. By 2018, Simon made a public decision. He announced what he described as his farewell tour. The tour, called Homeward Bound, moved across North America and Europe. Audiences filled arenas and theaters, aware that they might be witnessing the final large-scale performances of a musician who had been present in their lives for decades. Simon explained the decision with unusual directness. He spoke about the physical exhaustion of touring. He spoke about wanting to remain closer to his family. But he also acknowledged something that aging artists often face quietly. The body no longer tolerates the rhythm of travel and performance the way it once did. The farewell tour ended in September 2018 with a concert in Queens, New York, not far from where Simon had grown up. For many performers, retirement announcements are symbolic rather than permanent. But Simon's withdrawal from touring reflected a deeper shift. Because around the same period, another problem began emerging. His hearing. For a musician, hearing is not just a sense. It is a structural part of identity. Every chord change, every vocal adjustment, every subtle variation in pitch depends on precise auditory feedback. By the early 2020s, Simon began experiencing significant hearing loss in his left ear. Hearing loss among professional musicians is not unusual. Studies in occupational health show that long-term exposure to amplified sound dramatically increases the risk of auditory damage. Decades of recording studios, stage monitors, and live concerts create cumulative strain on the inner ear. For Simon, the condition progressed to the point where performing live became difficult. In 2023, he spoke publicly about the situation while promoting his album 7 Psalms. During interviews, he explained that he had suddenly lost most of the hearing in his left ear. Doctors could not fully restore it. The effect was practical and immediate. Without balanced hearing, performing with a band becomes complicated. Timing, pitch, and spatial awareness depend on hearing sound from multiple directions. Simon described the experience in simple terms. He could not hear the music the way he once had. For someone whose life had revolved around sound, the change was disorienting. At 84 years old, Paul Simon now lives a life that looks very different from the public image people carry from earlier decades. He spends much of his time at home with his wife, singer Edie Brickell, and their family. The routine is quieter. Morning often begins without urgency. No flights to catch. No rehearsal schedules waiting in another city. The guitar may still rest nearby, but the hours are no longer dictated by studio bookings or tour logistics. Age changes the physical mechanics of daily life. Hands that once moved quickly across guitar strings become slower. Finger joints stiffen. Muscle memory remains, but execution requires more patience. Simon still writes music occasionally, though the process is slower than it once was. During interviews, he has spoken about adjusting to hearing loss, experimenting with ways to continue working despite the limitation. Sometimes he listens to music through specialized headphones that compensate for the imbalance between his ears. But the reality remains. The sensory tool that guided his career has been partially taken away. Aging also alters the emotional landscape. Throughout his life, Simon maintained a reputation for discipline and control. He approached songwriting almost like engineering. Careful construction, revision, refinement. Now, in his 80s, the questions surrounding his legacy appear more frequently in conversation. Across American life expectancy statistics, the average male born in the early 1940s was not expected to live far beyond his mid-70s. Simon has already surpassed that benchmark. Longevity creates a different psychological experience. Many of the figures who shaped his early career are gone. His longtime partner Art Garfunkel remains alive, but their relationship has passed through decades of distance and occasional reconciliation. Producers, musicians, and friends from the 1960s and 1970s have gradually disappeared from the landscape of his life. The passage of time becomes visible through absence. In interviews, Simon has occasionally reflected on this reality without sentimentality. He speaks about the process of watching peers age, retire, or die. The music remains. Songs like The Sound of Silence, Bridge Over Troubled Water, and Graceland continue to circulate through radio, streaming platforms, and film soundtracks. Younger listeners still discover them, but the man who wrote them now occupies a quieter position. There are no more global tours stretching across months. There are fewer public appearances. The body that once endured endless travel now prefers stability. This is the mechanical truth of aging. Muscles lose elasticity. Hearing deteriorates. Vision narrows. Reaction times slow. Even memory changes its structure. Older adults often remember distant events with surprising clarity while struggling to recall small details from recent days. The brain reorganizes its priorities. For a songwriter like Simon, that phenomenon can create an unusual experience. The early years of his life remain vivid, while the present unfolds at a different speed. Sometimes he revisits the neighborhoods of Queens where he grew up. The streets are still there, though many buildings have changed. The local culture that shaped his childhood has been replaced by new generations and new languages. Cities evolve the same way people do. What remains are fragments. A school building where he first met Art Garfunkel. A park where teenagers once sang doo-wop harmonies under streetlights. Radio broadcasts drifting through apartment windows during summer evenings. Those memories form the foundation of a career that eventually reached millions of people. But memory is not the same as presence. At 84, Paul Simon lives in the final stage of a long artistic life. There is no dramatic collapse, no single catastrophic event that defines the end of the story. Instead, the tragedy, if it can be called that, is quieter. A man who spent his entire existence shaping sound now struggles to hear it fully. A performer who stood before thousands now lives mostly outside the spotlight. And the body that once carried him across stages around the world now moves carefully through ordinary rooms. This is the final transformation that awaits every artist. The applause fades. The lights turn off. The songs remain, but the person who created them must eventually step away. For Paul Simon, that moment has not arrived as a sudden ending. It has arrived gradually, through hearing loss, through age, through the slow reorganization of life around silence rather than performance. And yet, somewhere in that quiet space, the music still exists. Not on stage, not in arenas, but inside the mind of the man who once wrote it. A lifetime reduced to memory, melody, and the echo of voices that once sang beside him.